speaking first and in the middle here is Professor Angie Hobbs. Angie is a Professor for Public Understanding of Philosophy at the University of Sheffield here, contributor to BBC Radio 4's In Our Time, the Today programme, Radio 3's Night Waves, and also Radio 3's Private Passion very recently, where she was talking about her life and her work through musical choices. And she recently has been presenting The Ideas That Make Us on Radio 4 and is due to make an appearance soon in Parliament. Welcome to Angie. Speaking next will be Professor Frank Furedi. He's Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, a commentator and author of numerous books including Where Have All the Intellectuals Gone, then fittingly for tonight, Intolerance, In Defence of Moral Independence, and which is on sale at the back, and most recently just published Authority in Sociological History. Then speaking finally will be Professor Anthony Milton. He's Professor of History here at the University of Sheffield, author of Catholic and Reformed, the Roman and Protestant Churches in England, Protestant Thought, 1600 to 1640, and founding editor of Politics, Culture and Society in Early Modern Britain. So can we welcome our panel, please?
So, I've been asked to say something about the philosophy of tolerance, toleration and intolerance. And I think I want to start by saying we're currently in a mess about tolerance and intolerance in two ways. Firstly, the meaning of the terms. So in most modern philosophical discussions, there'll be a difference between toleration and tolerance. Toleration is more closely linked. Do come in, welcome. Hope there's seats there. Toleration is closely linked to the Latin root tolerantia, endurance, forbearance, and the notion of toleration is that you are permitting or allowing a belief or an action which you really don't like or approve of. You disapprove or dislike this belief or action, but you're permitting or tolerating it. And you are actually in a position to do something to stop the belief or action, but you choose not to. So you need those two conditions for toleration. One, that you don't like or approve of the belief or action or practice, and two, that you're in a position to stop it, to intervene in some way, but you choose not to. You permit it, you allow it. And that's toleration. Tolerance has a much more general meaning. Sometimes you'll see them used in the same way, but sometimes if they differ, tolerance would be a more sort of generous embrace or acceptance of diversity. So you don't necessarily need to disapprove of anything. You're embracing or accepting diversity. Now, as I said, the first problem is that those two are often used interchangeably, which that doesn't matter, just as long as we're aware of these two different layers of meaning. It doesn't matter really which term we use. In terms of the negative, we've only got one term, intolerance. We don't use the word intoleration. So intolerance has this enormously wide range of meanings. It can go from anything from intervening to kill the person whose belief or practice you don't like, right the way through to sort of raising an eyebrow in ironical, disgust. So I'm sure in the course of the evening we're going to be discussing the very many different forms that intolerance might take and which forms of intolerance might be acceptable or unacceptable. And that's part of the reason why we've got this linguistic muddle. So that's our first sort of thing we need to untangle. The second thing we need to untangle, and Jake's already alluded to this, is our very ambivalent attitude towards tolerance and intolerance at the moment in Western society, though I'll concentrate on British society. On the one hand, politically and in the media, tolerance and toleration are almost invariably used as hurrah words. They're just uncritically assumed to be a good thing. And that's all part of the rhetoric. And intolerance is uncritically assumed to be a bad thing. And I'll be saying later why I think that's a misguided position. But as Jake has also just said, though that's what we say, that we were in favour of tolerance and toleration and we disapprove of intolerance, in practice we're intolerant of all sorts of things, though the intolerance can express itself, as I've said, in very many different ways. In some ways, we're often more narrow-minded than a lot of our forebears. Okay, so two different messes. Now, I want to argue tonight that the terms tolerance and toleration on the one hand, and intolerance on the other, are neutral terms. They're not good or bad in themselves. It depends entirely on the belief or practice that's under consideration about whether they're a good or a bad thing or not. Okay, sorry, I'm just... because if you think about it, if we don't really think that every single kind of practice or act or belief should be just uncritically tolerated if we really scratch the surface. Because it'd be very quick for tolerance and toleration to just morph into indifference or laziness or cowardice. Some things should be fought against. Sometimes you should just not put up with certain practices, and possibly certain beliefs will come onto that. Okay, so though we will say rather lazily, let 1,000 flowers bloom, I'm suggesting that sometimes 999 flowers would do just fine. Okay, so how to work out the guidelines of when you tolerate an action or practice or belief you dislike or disapprove of, and when do you step in? I think in general that the existence of beliefs or practices that are different from your own, but which are not threatening your physical well-being in any way, should be tolerated. There's going to be a grey area, and I'll return to it, about whether they're threatening your psychological well-being. That's a much trickier area. So the very fact that there are people in the world who have a different political or religious belief from me, I should live with that. I hopefully would embrace it and celebrate that kind of diversity. But that, if people are not directly threatening me, the fact that they disagree should not be a problem for me. And if it is a problem for me, that should be my problem and not their problem. And I think we're getting a little too thin-skinned at the moment and a little too touchy about taking personally the existence of beliefs or practices that differ from our own, when those beliefs or practices are not directed personally at us. So why is tolerance and toleration of these different beliefs and practices, when they are not directly threatening at us, why is it a good thing? Okay, let's look at some of the philosophical arguments behind this. I've got 5. So, if you refuse to allow people to express their beliefs or engage in practices which are not harming others, and again we'll come back to what harm might mean, and if you refuse to allow them to do that, you make them repress the expression of their beliefs and practices, you risk doing serious harm to their psychological well-being. 2, and this is an argument made by the philosopher Locke, I think in 1688, in his his letter on tolerance, very famous work. He says that if you repress the beliefs and practices of people who differ from you, you risk civil unrest. Because by forcing people to repress what they desperately want to express, you actually just foster political discord and hatred, and it will eventually erupt in violence. So for the peace of the nation, he says, is usually, not always, but usually best fostered by toleration of different beliefs and practices. He was pretty limited, actually, in what kind of differences he allowed. He really only allows different practices in the Protestant religion. He doesn't extend his tolerance to either Catholicism or atheism. So he's not quite as tolerant as people sometimes think he is. 3, legally enforced tolerance and toleration are required to protect human rights. And I don't think it's any accident that in philosophy and political theory, the arguments about tolerance really arise in the 17th and 18th centuries, when, of course, we begin to get the big discourse in Britain and America and France and so on human rights. 4, and this is an argument made most forcibly by John Stuart Mill in the mid-19th century in his work on liberty. 4, you need to test your own beliefs and values and practices against counter-beliefs and counter-arguments in order to retain them as genuinely understood and held beliefs which you really understand and appreciate. If you don't test your ideas against opposing arguments and views, beliefs, even if they're true beliefs, are likely to ossify into dogma. So this is one of the main arguments that John Stuart Mill gives for the importance of freedom of expression. Not completely without any shackles on it at all, but in most cases. He says it's very, very important to retain beliefs as genuine beliefs and not as merely repeated dogmas, which can become very dangerous. They must be tested in the cauldron of opposing ideas and arguments, hopefully put in a civilised and friendly manner. I take it that's one of the things that the salons and off the shelf are for. And 5, an epistemological argument, an argument about the theory of knowledge and how we know things. How can you know you're right? How can you be so sure that your belief, your practice is the right one? The French philosopher, 16th century philosopher Montaigne puts this beautifully. He says, it's putting a very high value on one's conjectures. He says, to have a man roasted alive because of them. And he says, to kill people, there must be sharp and brilliant clarity. And he thinks that we just don't have sharp and brilliant clarity on almost anything to the degree that would allow us to intervene to kill people. It's one of the arguments that Locke, in that letter on tolerance I mentioned earlier, it's one of his main arguments for religious toleration. He says that no human on earth, no king, nobody can have access to total divine knowledge and knowledge about God. So no human is in a position to say categorically that somebody else's religious belief is totally wrong. We just have to be a bit more humble than that, a bit less arrogant. And given that, we should allow religious toleration. Okay, so those are 5 arguments for religious toleration in those cases where there is simply the existence of a belief or practice that you dislike or disagree with but is not actively harming. When should you intervene? Because I've said that there are some cases when I think you should. That you don't just want to tolerate everything and just be indifferent to what's going on in the world. You don't want to be morally lazy or cowardly. Well, clearly if you are under physical threat, you should intervene. What about if you are under psychological threat? And this is where it gets into the very difficult grey area. What if somebody is attacking you, not physically, but in terms of their words? What should or shouldn't be tolerated? Now, I find this a very tricky one. I accept that there are some cases, if somebody is just going on and somebody saying, you are scum, you are vile, because of your sexuality, because of your religion, because you have red hair or whatever. Actually, there's quite a lot of gingerism on the net at the moment. So Harriet Harman not that long ago called Danny Alexander a ginger rodent. I tweeted that Harriet Harman would find out that redheads were not to be messed with. But anyway, what point do you intervene if somebody's verbally attacking you? Now this, I don't know what my fellow panellists here, on the whole, yes, thank you. I think that though there are some cases where somebody is very vulnerable and psychologically vulnerable and there should be intervention, on the whole, I think at the moment we need to be a little bit more robust about people criticising us verbally than we currently are. It's not always pleasant, but I believe that in most cases freedom of expression is very, very important for democracy and for the furtherance of human knowledge. Freedom of expression is needed, is one of the prerequisites of a tolerant society. Which is going to tolerate minorities and people with views different from your own. But one of the other side of the coin of freedom of expression is you've got to put up most of the time with people who say things that you don't like or even criticise you. So, and except in those cases where somebody is really clearly being psychologically damaged and made ill by verbal abuse, and I accept those cases can happen, I think on the whole I would rather freedom of expression won out and we were a bit more robust and followed my old nanny's advice. If somebody mocked you or criticised you and said, she would say, "Don't worry dear," she said, "it's themselves they're demeaning, not you, just don't worry about it." I accept there are exceptions. Okay, so to conclude, I've got 1 minute and 20 seconds to conclude. Do we tolerate the intolerant as a result of what I've said? Roughly, on the whole, we do if they're being intolerant through words, and this is Rawls's point, the philosopher Rawls. He thinks that tolerating the intolerant, providing their intolerance is only verbal, helps bring the intolerant into society and doesn't ostracise them and alienate them, and again it's part of the importance of a free society and free speech. There can be exceptions, and Popper makes the point that beyond a certain point tolerating the intolerant will abolish toleration itself. We need to remember the lessons from history. Words can lead to actions. The Nazis started off by using incendiary language, and then they burnt books, and then of course they burnt people. So we need to remember those lessons and remember words can develop into actions, but while they stay words, on the whole, it's a difficult tightrope, but I would say we have to live with people who don't like us. Okay, so a little bit of the philosophical background to tolerance and intolerance and toleration. And so they're not good or bad in themselves. It depends entirely on the action or practice. And on the whole, I'd rather err on the side of tolerance and toleration rather than risk damaging freedom of expression. But there are limits beyond which we should not cross, and toleration becomes moral cowardice and laziness. Thank you.
Thank you. I became interested in the whole idea of tolerance when I did a series of lectures in Europe. And when I went to Italy or France or Holland or Germany, people in the audience always came up with the same kind of questions and objections to my arguments on the importance of free speech. And basically the argument that they put up against free speech was that free speech was a wonderful idea. You know, they really supported free speech, except in those cases where they found themselves at odds with the person who was freely attacking them. And you know, I was in Amsterdam, and I'm one of the few sociologists that actually argues that it's wrong to ban sort of Holocaust denial. I think you should politically fight it, you should expose its hypocrisy, but to legally ban people from arguing that the Holocaust did not exist is just a fundamentally wrong act. And there's a Muslim guy there in the audience, and he says, yeah, Professor Furedi, I totally agree with you. These Jewish people have had it for a very, very long time. You know, and I think it's important that we should be able to say whatever we want. And then, I went back and we were discussing, and then when I indicated that it's equally wrong to ban people who criticize the Prophet Muhammad, or who basically argued that the Quran has got some problems with it, he immediately put up his hands. No, in this case, we must, sort of not allow people to make that kind of criticism. And when I was in Berlin, I had the opposite, where there was a couple of Jewish people in the audience. And they thought it was really very brave of me to give people the right to criticize the Quran and to criticize the Prophet Muhammad. But the Holocaust cannot be denied. That is beyond the pale. And therefore, in that particular case, sort of we should be intolerant of free speech. So the point I find very curious, and this is why I wrote my book on the subject, is that we have a really powerful sort of sensibility of double standard at all levels of Western society. We, on the one hand, talk about tolerance as being really good, but in practice, we routinely violate it. And most people that I know of in this area spend far more energy developing arguments as to why we should not tolerate something than why we should extend our tolerance. When I go to the United States, far more legal scholars are developing arguments about limiting the First Amendment, particularly on free speech, than about extending it. Right? In other words, the democratic moment of expanding democratic rights has gone into reverse. That's what really interested me, and one of the things I've been doing, and I've continued to do this since I wrote my book, is to go back in history and understand, what is really happening. Why do we have this incredible sort of Hippocratic reaction to views that we are uncomfortable with? And of course, the answer is actually quite simple, which is that to be tolerant is a very unnatural thing to be. I mean, you know yourself that you often hear things and you feel like, sort of kind of metaphorically, hitting somebody, or you feel like kind of yelling at and shouting. We all have, views about ourselves, often on very personal matters about our lifestyle. And when they criticize, sort of we kind of react against it. It's a very unnatural thing. And, one of the things about history, and we learn this from history, is that throughout most of human history, the virtue that people adhered to was intolerance rather than tolerance. I mean, if you're a good Catholic living in the 12th, 13th century, you actually boasted about the fact that, we're intolerant of heresy. We're intolerant of all these horrible religions. And that's who we are. And every religion, not just Catholicism, Judaism, sort of everything else that was going on, reacted pretty much in the same kind of way. So it's a very unnatural thing to be genuinely tolerant. I think Angie outlined the difference between tolerance and toleration quite clearly. I would put a slightly different emphasis on tolerance, and maybe, strictly speaking, my understanding of tolerance is not the same as that put forward by some philosophers like Locke or Spinoza. But the way that I understand tolerance is that it's not a neutral concept. Right? If tolerance was merely a neutral concept, in the way that, for example, Locke talked about it, because Locke did have a neutral concept of tolerance, a very instrumental idea. We're tolerant because if we weren't tolerant, there'd be more wars between religions, there'd be strife. We need to keep things a little bit level-headed. Otherwise, basically the 30 Years' War will become the 100 Years' War or the 200 Years' War, because people just go on killing each other. So we need a bit of tolerance, but not because we particularly think it's a good thing, that it's got any inherent virtues. It just makes sense. It's a very sensible way of dealing with things. Myself, I think that we need to think of tolerance not just neutrally, but as a positive virtue. That's something that is good in and of itself. It seems to me, unless we have a substantively positive ideal of tolerance, then we are going to run into a lot of trouble. And it seems to me that there are a number of reasons as to why tolerance is a positive virtue. The most important reason for me is that it allows people to think and talk, and in most cases to act in accordance with their conscience. I think that is really quite important, that people are allowed to do that. And I've got, for example, I'm somebody who is a big believer in pro-choice when it comes to reproduction. I believe in women's right to choose and abortion. But also, if I find there's a doctor, a Christian doctor, who doesn't want to perform an abortion, I, as a tolerant individual, have got to recognize his right to act in accordance with his conscience. I think that is something that has got a positive humanist element into that we need to be very sort of sensitive about. I think even more importantly for me, and this is something that I get from Aristotle in particular, one of the important things about tolerance is that it gives us, it celebrates the fact that people ought to be able to act in accordance with their judgment. I mean, Aristotle had this virtue called phronesis, which has got different definitions and different meanings, but what it does recognize is the importance of human beings cultivating the capacity to make judgment calls, to be able to judge and to act on that. And it seems to me that what tolerance does, when we tolerate people to believe certain ideas and to act on it, is to allow them to cultivate their moral persona, from Mills onward, to kind of increasingly characterize it as moral autonomy. We allow people to develop their kind of personality and to kind of make their own way in the world with the least amount of barriers and the least amount of limits that is possible. And I think that tolerance, to me, is a big virtue. It's not neutral, because without tolerance, it is very difficult to imagine how you develop intellectually as a society. I mean, I think Angie was talking about the importance of testing out ideas. The ideas need to be tested out from Mills. But more broadly, in the whole development of the whole intellectual development of a society requires the clash of opinions, requires that we have to account for our views. And most important of all, this is something that we often ignore, requires that we deal with those very uncomfortable moments in our lives when we kind of feel under pressure, where we're often offended, insulted, where we've got to come up with ways and means of dealing with this situation. That's how intellectual clarification occurs. And it seems to me that those two things, intellectual development and the making of judgment, are hugely important. It's something that we really underestimate. And I think one of the reasons, in fact, why our tolerance in our society is so ambivalent, why we're, as I'll argue, quite hypocritical about tolerance, is because although we formally adhere to the idea of tolerance, we celebrate it, we tell our little children, be tolerant, it's a really good thing. It's kind of a Sunday school preaching sort of acknowledgement of tolerance. At the same time as we do that, what's very interesting is that one of the principal virtues of 21st century Western societies is the idea of non-judgmentalism. If you have a child that does PHSC or any of these bollocks subjects in school, you'll often find that one day they will learn about tolerance, really important, and usually have cute little children of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds holding hands, and that's what tolerance means. You're being nice to each other. Very unobjectionable. So on the one hand, we have that. On the other hand, a day later, they will learn that it's very important not to be judgmental. Right? It's really important that you don't make judgment calls. Which is an interesting thing, because without the capacity to make judgments, you cannot be tolerant. Right? I mean, the reason why you're tolerant is because you decided that although what you heard is really horrible and disgusting, and you violently disagree with it, and you're making a judgment about somebody. You're not actually passively saying that, oh yeah, that's cool, in a very kind of indifferent way. You don't like what you hear. Nevertheless, you are going to tolerate that because you think it's important that those kinds of views ought to be heard, and people should have the right to say those things. So, making judgments is central to tolerance. Without judgment, there is no tolerance. Tolerance becomes merely a perfunctory, passive acceptance. And as Hannah Arendt argued in a very powerful passage, what she really argues is that if we don't make judgments, then we neither tolerate nor take each other seriously. Basically kind of pass each other by in a kind of very casual kind of a way, where we just essentially become entirely indifferent to one another. I don't know if you realize, but in the United States, most surveys indicate, a survey carried by Pew Trust recently indicated that the one virtue that the majority, the vast majority of Americans sign up to as the American virtue is non-judgmentalism. Right? What is in fact a fundamentally anti-democratic, sort of sensibility has been recast and repackaged as being American. We're not going to judge you. You do this and we do that, and of course no conversation, and obviously no public space either. So I think that side of it is really sort of quite important. As a sociologist, I'm particularly sensitive to the way in which the meaning of tolerance has been reinterpreted in a very kind of, in a way that I do not recognize. And the way it's been interpreted is essentially to suggest that there's something wrong about it. It's not quite right. I mean, tolerance is okay when little children hold each other's hands and sing Kumbaya and songs like that. But in any other context, so tolerance is not really a good thing. And a speech that I remember very, very clearly was one made by David Cameron, our Prime Minister, who said that we're not going to tolerate people who tolerate terrorism. And he then went on to say is that intolerance of passive tolerance towards terrorism is what's on our agenda. I thought it was an interesting idea because on the one hand he implied that intolerance is a good thing, that there's something inherently virtuous about that. He then went on to say that passive tolerance, should be, somehow sidelined. The implication being that tolerance can be passive. I mean, the idea that tolerance can be passive is a complete contradiction in terms, because tolerance involves a judgment. And what he's really saying is that, on balance, being tolerant is the soft option. The real pussycats are the tolerant ones, but the hard, virile, kind of combative individuals like him are going to be intolerant, and that's a good thing. And since I heard that speech, on numerous occasions I've heard tolerance used in the most degraded fashion. I was debating somebody in Brussels from the EU, and he was arguing that, as against my position, that Europe, and he's the expression, was criminally tolerant towards Hitler. Criminally tolerant towards Hitler. As if somehow Europeans, say, okay, Adolf, just kind of walk in. As if somehow tolerance had anything to do with the kind of tendency towards betrayals, the tendency towards acquiescence. As if somehow, tolerance can be associated with criminality. And that's what I find really objectionable, that criminality and tolerance could be used in the same breath. Because what you were doing was actually ultimately debasing what is a virtue. Now, we have a lot of problem with tolerance, as I indicated, but at least we're discussing it, and we've come to the point at which we half-heartedly understand how valuable that is. And I think for that reason, it's important that we adopt a very robust, tolerant attitude towards everybody, including the intolerant. Because if we ever become intolerant towards the intolerant, what we're saying is that we're using your weapons, we're using your approach to fight you. And that's another way of saying is we've given up and you won. So I think that at the end of the day, we have no choice but to tolerate even the intolerable. Thank you.
A historian's job, it seems to me, is not to say on the basis of the 16th and 17th century, this is what you should be doing and thinking. Why put David Starkey on Question Time? I don't understand it. Essentially, as I understand it, my job as a historian is to point out when people have certain historical notions behind the social and political ideas that they have nowadays, which might require amendment. And I think regardless of whether you're interested in history or not, certain assumptions about the past will underlie all of your basic attitudes towards political and social issues. The fact that you don't realise you've got them shows just how elemental they are. Quite often, therefore, looking at what that historical background might be, where there might be historical misinterpretation, can help to reshape a little bit some of our assumptions. It seems to me also history does not teach lessons. The past can't simply be reproduced, but it can tell us other things. It can help to explain how we got to where we are. We can follow the process whereby past ideas and events led to where we are. Also, we can learn through contrast. The past is a foreign country. It can therefore teach us how things might be approached in a rather different way, how freed from our current debates, our current assumptions, certain issues, certain problems might have been dealt with in a slightly different way. We can learn different angles of approach to problems that we have nowadays. So I'd like to begin with a quiz. Quick question. The second largest city in England has a population, a third of whom are foreign immigrants. They speak a different language and they have their own places of worship. What period am I talking about? Any suggestions? Any loud suggestions I can hear? 13th century. Keep going. Present day is obviously the one I was hoping you would say, so I could say no. Someone said Norwich, spot on, you get extra marks for that. I'm actually talking about the 16th century, Shakespeare's England. Second largest city is Norwich. These are Dutch immigrants. Which partly goes to make the obvious point that the forced coexistence of people with very different ideas and different cultural identity is not something that simply the modern world is facing. This is something which was being faced in the 16th century, but also right past through history as well. This is a normal thing that human societies have to deal with. Also, they're dealing with it before Enlightenment ideas of definitions of toleration. They are having to find ways of dealing with it without classical tolerationist notions. And that makes another point about the Enlightenment, about Locke, about Mill, and other writers on toleration, who always appear in histories of toleration, is that they're not just giving us an Enlightenment definition of toleration, they're also giving us a view of the past. And I would argue a very distorted view of the past, as an era of intolerance, of visceral hatred of anything different, which has been circumvented and improved upon by Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers. Every one of the 5 points which Angie was summarising from Locke were expressed in some shape or form in the medieval period and in the 16th century as well. Not precisely as he formulated, but notions that people have a freedom of conscience, that freedom of religious belief is essential, that the conscience cannot be forced, that the existence of disparate ideas, different ideas, is potentially a good thing because it means truth can be better arrived at by interaction with different ideas, is again very much a medieval notion as well. So another problem is the assumption that the practice of toleration leads on naturally from ideas, classical ideas of toleration. I'd like to suggest that it often works actually the other way around. We begin with practical religious toleration, the ideas often come later. Another worry I have about talking about toleration in terms of Enlightenment ideas is that it does rather imply we're talking about an exclusively Western phenomenon, particularly a Western discovery. A lot of the history of toleration is talked about in terms of the discovery of toleration, and of course it is supposedly a Western discovery. So time for another quick quiz. Which country has as its official national slogan, unity in diversity? Any ideas?
Turkey.
Turkey? Good guess. No. You're warm.
Sorry?
It's Indonesia. Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. Unity in diversity. It's derived from a 14th century Javanese poem, which is about religious toleration. It talks about how two religions share the same essence. Which is to make the point that there is a non-Western experience of and tradition of toleration following its own unusual roots. But also, I suppose, to point out one way in which I am disagreeing with Frank is that I don't think that toleration is unnatural. I actually think precisely the opposite. That degrees of toleration of cultural, ethnic, religious diversity are actually one of the commonplaces of human society and human history. That a degree of coexistence and a degree of cultural hybridity is the norm. Forms of assimilation, appropriation, adaptation are actually central to the way that cultural interaction tends to work. If there is a cultural difference, an ideological difference, that can often be trumped by a whole range of other factors: honour, loyalty, friendship, affection, kinship, civic duty, devotion to the local community, devotion to the local football club. A whole range of things can either strengthen a cultural identity or remarkably qualify it. Particularly religious identity may be significantly qualified by those particular forces. And this really moves on to a more general point about cultural identities and cultural traditions. That identities and traditions are not fixed things that people struggle with to accommodate change. Identities and traditions are building sites. They are constantly under change and adaptation. They are constantly potentially open to different influences, to the influence of different groups. So I would tend to suggest that the story of toleration is not of a Western discovery, but rather it's a story of a dialogue, of a constant debate between different groups about what toleration is, what it means, and how far it can go, what its particular limits are. Most groups accept something like toleration, but will disagree violently about how far it should go, what it actually means. So I'd like to get away from the idea that we have pre-Enlightenment darkness and then tolerance coming along, which maybe has now gone a little bit too far. It does seem to me, if you look at the last few decades in the Balkans, in the Near and the Middle East, in South Asia, what we see, it seems to me, is an increasing pattern of persecution and the driving out and destruction of religious, ethnic and cultural minorities. Minorities that had been surviving relatively undisturbed for century after century. It seems to me that is the current global issue, is the erosion of long-term, centuries-old toleration by newly assertive, increasingly exclusive national identities. The problem, of course, is that a single act of ethnic cleansing or violence can wipe out a history of months, years, decades, centuries of coexistence and cultural integration. The fact that the one can so easily wipe out the other means we sometimes get our evidence a little bit distorted about what we're potentially looking at. So, one or two quick points. It does seem to me that rather than focusing on ideas of toleration, it's sometimes rather useful to focus instead on the practice of toleration. And to look maybe briefly at how toleration works in pre-modern societies. I can say right away that it's not based on equality, it's not based on mutual respect, it's certainly not based on approval. It's based essentially on turning a blind eye. It's remarkable just how much of a blind eye committed religious zealots seem to be able to turn on a daily basis in early modern society. It's not necessarily trouble-free. Certainly there are not potentially tensions there under the surface as well. What tends to drive direct conflict tends to be the way in which difference manifests itself. And that is to do crucially with the degree to which it is provocative towards other groups. Now, provocation, of course, is a very slippery concept. Different groups will see provocation where others don't. Nevertheless, there tend to be unwritten rules about how far difference can manifest itself, which means that you can have the existence of culturally very different groups way beyond what they're legally entitled to do, quietly going about their business, as long as they don't do it in a direct, in-your-face, public way. That very heretical ideas will be accepted as long as they are not published and stuck on the door of a church. What I'd like to suggest, therefore, is homing in on one phrase, which I know for this particular Salon session was written down, and I immediately started at, was raising the question of how we cope with having to live with the thoughts and words of others. And I think that phrase is part of the problem, really, because it's eliding belief and thoughts and expression and presentation all together as if they're the same thing. Whereas for most periods of history, it's teasing out those issues of what do we mean by expressing that thought, how are you speaking, where are you speaking. The question isn't what do you have a right to say, but how are you saying it? Are you saying it privately or publicly? Are you saying it in a directly polemical way? Are you saying it in a restrained way? Are you speaking just within your own local community? Are you saying it in the marketplace? I'm told I have 2 minutes left, but I have been very careful to go to 10 minutes rather than 15 minutes, so I should be able to finish just about right now, except a final point on the question of indifference, which it feels odd to be disagreeing with some of Frank's stuff on the history, because I agree fundamentally with just about everything he writes on tolerance. My one thing where I have a slight worry is on the question of indifference, which I think Frank has made an important point about the concern that pure indifference nowadays, intolerance, is showing a lack of any sort of moral criterion at all. It does seem to me in most periods of history a degree of, dare one say, benign indifference has been combined with having a strong moral focus. It's just that people decide not to deploy it when turning that blind eye and partly ignoring another group. And I think that benign indifference seems in the past to have been one of the crucial ways in which cultural difference is negotiated. Thank you.
Just a few words on history, where I think we do disagree a little bit. The way I would understand the situation is that tolerance is really something that evolves at a particular moment in early modernity, and is principally a Western accomplishment. Not just principally, entirely a Western European accomplishment, later kind of transport to the United States. And the reason for that isn't because Westerners are better people than anybody else, and it isn't because, something kind of magical happens in the air. I think that we're talking about something very different. I think what Anthony was talking about is essentially coexistence. And there are many examples of Middle Eastern societies, of other societies where coexistence was practiced and cultivated very, very effectively. In Greece, for example, there were very early ideas which you could stretch to be the precursors of tolerance. For example, some interesting work done on free speech in Athens, what they call free speech. But it doesn't really mean free speech in the way that we understand it. But nevertheless, there is a tendency that if you read Pericles' funeral speech, for example, there are bits here and there where he talks about, we allow people to what they want to do at home. Angie will know better exactly how to phrase that, but he's really saying something that we kind of begin to recognize as similar to us. And I think, of course, it is the case that we have a very one-sided view of the medieval era as an age of darkness, and it wasn't like that by any means. But nevertheless, the medieval era, to me, maybe at a very naive view of history, is one that I associate with crusades, which didn't give Jewish people a really good time as they kind of went through sort of Europe. It's associated with heresy and various heresy hunting that is going on. It's associated with the Inquisition, which will become eventually the Inquisition, but at a very early point with witch hunting that kind of emerges at that particular point in time. So by and large, it really wasn't a fun place in terms of differences of ideas. And I think that, I suppose what I'm really trying to get at is that yes, in the past there was the acceptance of diversity, But it was done, as has been suggested, entirely on a pragmatic, instrumental basis, which is good. It's better than not having that. But tolerance, and the beauty of tolerance and the virtue, is that it's not just about pragmatism, it's not just about putting up, but actually recognizing, and this is the whole humanist moment, it begins with humanism, slightly for the Enlightenment, it's recognizing the virtues of being able to act in accordance with your humanity, of being able to cultivate your moral autonomy, and that is historically specific, and something that we find very difficult to live up to.
Okay. Angie.
Thank you. Just 2 points. One to Anthony. I wasn't trying to suggest that tolerance and toleration were invented in the 16th and 17th centuries. I was simply saying that some of the clearest arguments in philosophy come from Montaigne and Locke and Mill and others in those centuries. I completely accept that there are many other periods in history in which the toleration of other views was indeed encouraged for all sorts of intellectual and political reasons. I specialise in ancient Greek studies, and though of course they had their blips, like putting Socrates to death in 399, on the whole, the late 5th century Athens is a culture of extraordinary encouragement and acceptance of very critical views. I give you one example, which is one of the most extraordinary plays ever written in 415 BC, at the height of the war between Athens and Sparta, when Athens had just committed a terrible war crime in having the male population of the island of Melos put to death and enslaving the women and children. The playwright Euripides wrote and put on at one of the festivals the Trojan women, which, though it's set in the past, though it's set in the setting of the Odyssey and the Iliad, with the Iliad, is clearly a very, very strong attack on Greek war crimes. And the part of the Melians is taken over by the part of the Trojans. It would be like a British playwright putting on a play attacking the British for bombing Dresden the day after Dresden occurred. And he wasn't put to death, he didn't get first prize, he got second prize, but still. So I completely accept Anthony's point. It's not that tolerance was invented with the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment clearly expressed some of the arguments for it, but with limits. Now, what I would want to just quickly ask Frank is, I accept most of your arguments for the importance of tolerance and toleration in most contexts, but surely not all. You talk about the importance of following one's conscience, but some people's conscience says presumably prompt them to attack Jews or homosexuals or the Roma or whatever. Some people's character development presumably encourage them to develop their paedophilic tendencies. So I'm not even sure I believe you really believe everything you're saying. I'd like to explore that more later. Thank you.
Thank you. Partly I just wanted to thank Frank for clarifying the fact that obviously I'm mostly talking about coexistence. I do think when toleration is written about, there is often an implication that either coexistence follows from it or is indissolubly linked to it. I do think sometimes we run the risk, however, of assuming that practical coexistence can have no thought behind it at all. But presumably when we have communities which are tolerating people of a completely different religion and culture, something may be going through their minds. It may not be a philosophical principle or nostrum, but nevertheless to say that this is some strange sort of unthinking, horribly dirty, pragmatic way of doing things, I think is maybe doing violence to the degree to which there may be cultural interaction and ideas between people. I will just speak up very briefly for the medieval period. It does seem to me bad things are going on, but if we also look at late medieval Spain before the Spanish stopped butchering people, we have a remarkable degree of religious syncretism going on. Even if we're looking at the treatment of heretics in medieval Europe, the theory of tolerantia, which is embedded in canon law, allows for and indeed specifically defends the toleration of non-believers. So Jews and Muslims are okay, not because, well, you have to put up with them. This is actually enshrined in canon law. Certainly they don't like heretics on the inside, but I think a lot of the history of toleration and intolerance tends to be written around one or two specific acts of butchery, like the Crusades, like the butchering of Jews in Lincoln and so on. And we're often missing quite a lot of the other mood music going on. I'll just say, I mean, medieval Catholic theology is very sophisticated and very complex. There are quite subtle ideas about conscience and degrees of toleration embedded within it.
I'd like to start to pick up with a point that Angie made, the first speaker. She listed 5 points, very, very good reasons, I thought, why we should value toleration. And it relates to the biggest problems I see in culture now, where we have a whole creed which is entrenched in the dominant political ideologies now, which is identity politics, PC. This is supposed to be about consideration for, or tolerance for, various forms of minorities. In actual fact, if you look at all the various scholarship, the origins of this, about 1930, is anything but. It's all actually about attacking people like me, basically, working class, white males. So we have a situation here where tolerance has been so completely abused that it's been completely inverted in itself, that there's a whole assumption that I bought this, started off with the political left, that there is a virulent intolerance amongst this group to accept any discussion. People like me, not just short, ugly males like me, but anyone who attacks PC basically has no platform. So also if you go on to discuss, for example, ramifications like domestic violence, that all the science shows actually more domestic violence, females than the other way around. You cannot raise that anywhere outside science circles. This is the biggest problem of the day, and this relates directly to what we're talking about.
I happen to belong to the 52% oppressed majority, which I think clearly exists and continues to exist, and the ethos continues to oppress us. Under capitalism in the last 30 years, our rights as women have been eroded and eroded and eroded, and include our toleration in these shores of things like female genital mutilation, because we bend over backwards, and also, sexual slavery, really. And my daughters and my granddaughter are growing up in a much less tolerant kind of environment for women and girls. And I think, obviously, hate crimes should be criminalised, and that includes violent pornography, which is hugely prevalent.
It's something Angie mentioned right at the beginning was tolerance depending on, and intolerance depending on your power to intervene. I think tolerance and power have a very close relationship. And what is the role of the powerless in terms of tolerance and intolerance? What's our role in relation to bankers? Do we tolerate their behaviour because we haven't got the power to intervene? What's that dynamic? The other point I wanted to make is the discussion slightly confused by treating tolerance and intolerance as being on the same continuum. For me, intolerance is an irrational thing. If I don't tolerate something, that is not the same as being intolerant, because I'm making a rational judgment. For me, intolerance comes from some dogma or something else which isn't necessarily rational. I'd like the panel's view on that.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to come the opposite way, so from Anthony first.
I suppose just briefly on the spectrum issue of tolerance and intolerance, whether they're completely separate things. I can see, I think Angie was making the point very nice at the beginning that intolerance doesn't tend to be very clearly defined, and it's potentially absorbing a huge range of issues. It does seem to me, actually, the more one looks into writing and thinking and behaving on tolerance issues, the more convinced I become that there is a spectrum, that everyone has certain things that they're prepared to tolerate and not tolerate, and that is a constantly shifting position. I think to brand certain people as simply intolerant and others as simply tolerant is misleading. I think Frank's work has actually shown extremely well how tolerance can shade into intolerance in a very, very easy way.
Yeah, so Angie, if you'd like to come back on some of the stuff on the floor.
Yes, thank you. So you made a really good point about the relation between tolerance and intolerance and power. And certainly in the technical sense of tolerance, meaning you're putting up with something which you could intervene to alter it if you chose to. That shows, as you're absolutely right, that tolerance is something allowed in those with some power, and those who are completely without power to intervene don't really have the option to be tolerant or indeed intolerant in that technical sense. So I think that's a really good point. You said that it's rational to not, sorry, I suppose an infinitive there. It's rational, I can't not, okay. It's rational to not tolerate, apologies to my English teacher, certain aspects, but it's irrational to be intolerant in general. Well, I just say again and again that whether the rationality or otherwise of either tolerance or intolerance depends entirely on the object in question, on the practice or belief in question. But if your point is that it's irrational to be just generally intolerant, to just stump through life, being against everything, then I would agree with you. You know, what's that great 50s film? You know, what are you rebelling against? What do you got? You know, so that I can take. The point that you were making, I don't feel part of, in this platform, I don't feel a part of, it'd be great to have lots more women always talking. We tend to get shot down on Twitter when we do, but that just shows that more of us need to be doing it. I'm a friend of Mary Beard, and she's put up with the most extraordinary abuse. I don't particularly feel oppressed, but I think, to me, it's as much about education, money, class, the fact that I grew up in the south of England in a white community in a middle-class family. I was lucky enough to be educated. I think for very many women grew up in very different circumstances around the world, and they do still genuinely suffer huge intolerance and abuse in a way that I didn't. So I don't particularly feel oppressed. I do notice that, what I sort of wear gets commented on emails and on Twitter more than probably a man would. But somebody wrote to me recently saying, "I hate your hat, you look like Paddington Bear." It's very odd what people do in an evening. I wrote back saying, "How very, very kind of you to make the comparison. Paddington was always one of my heroes." So I hope that really annoyed him. But anyway, thank you.
Brilliant.
The point of tolerance and power, I think there's a relationship, but the relationship I see is one where without tolerance and without the freedoms that are implied by tolerance, it's very difficult for the powerless to become powerful. And historically, the struggle for freedoms, the struggle for liberty, the struggle for tolerance were always inextricably linked to people trying to wrest some power for themselves, to try to, in a sense, gain a bit of mastery over their circumstances. And therefore I see transformative politics of any shape or form as being inextricably linked to the, in a sense, the celebration of tolerance in all of its shape and form. I don't think there's a continuum between tolerance and intolerance. I think it's an irrational attempt to find a continuum in other than a purely rhetorical sense. For the very simple reason that, that intolerance, that when we see that we don't tolerate something, we're using toleration and tolerance in a kind of slightly colloquial sense, in a very imprecise kind of sense. So for example, I think it's quite legitimate not to put up with, Nazis in Germany, attacking people and breaking their windows. I think it's entirely legitimate to sort of stop people who racially abuse particular ethnic groups. It's it's quite legitimate, but that's not being intolerant. In other words, we're not being intolerant. There's a whole different language for that, and the language is one of politically struggling against it or fighting against it. In fact, it's precisely because of our commitment to tolerance that we need to do this. And in particular, I think it's important to realize that tolerance and toleration are principally about beliefs and being able to express yourself through those beliefs. It's not about action. It's not really about action. Tolerance has got nothing to do with your reaction to a particular set of actions, because actions we judge entirely on the basis as to whether they harm other people, as to whether they break the law, as to whether they oppress individuals. There a whole different set of criteria enter into it. If we extend tolerance to the domain of action, then we put a far too great a burden on it, and it becomes pretty much emptied out of meaning and becomes not a very useful concept in that way.
I'd like to ask the panel, especially our historian here, what is it that undoes toleration big time?
I'd like to continue the thread of tolerance and toleration among the powerful and the powers. I think that's possibly the most interesting point that's been raised so far. And I would like to put it within the framework of a struggle for liberty, be that, as a very strong example, feminism, or a struggle for liberty from ethnic minorities, any kind of oppressed people. Within the community of the oppressed, be it women, blacks, Jews, whatever, to what extent should those people tolerate the views of their oppressors when they wish to weigh in? When a man wants to enter a feminist space and share his 2 cents, I'd like to ask the panel to what extent that should be tolerated.
This congregation has always had a platform of toleration and free speech. No doubt difficulties can be found with that. But we have experienced through certainly the second half of the 20th century and even into now a severe limitation on free speech, in that the BBC have never wanted to have anything to do with this and will not let us speak. And I think there are other minority religions who could also say the same thing. And I'd like to know what the panel think about that.
Quick point, it's interesting that Angie brought up Twitter, because I think it's quite an example of kind of where the debate is going on in contemporary society. So we have a large number of plotting out idiots who say horrible things in a kind of totally uncontrolled manner, and then the response to them is to get them arrested, which I don't know kind of if people want to pick up on that point a bit further. To Frank, you kind of talk about this kind of very high point in the 17th and 18th century where people are formulating these ideas of tolerance, and things seem to have gone right down the toilet in terms of toleration nowadays. Where do you think things have gone wrong?
Well, actually, I think we are reasonably tolerant in historical terms, but we're struggling with it, and we're principally very hypocritical in the way that we're going about it. But it's not all bad news. I mean, the very fact that people are raising all these kind of concerns is symptomatic of that. I do have some sympathy for the lady there about your kind of predicament, because although I'm an atheist, and find myself estranged from religion, I do find it a bit worrying that every time you have Christian people in public life, for example, not just your denomination, but more broadly, there seems to be a certain kind of double standard that has crept in. And I don't see why it's wrong, for example, for people to have a cross when they work at British Air. Why is it that there seems to be this desire to marginalize that? I also think it's wrong that other religions, are kind of kept at an arm's length, and there's an attempt to kind of ban or regulate their behavior in ways. For example, I think it's horrific that in Europe there's a campaign to ban Jewish children and Muslim children from being circumcised. Something that they fought for thousands of years, quite integral to their religion. All of a sudden, we decide that this is our business to begin to ban those kinds of things. So I do worry about the way in which, there is a kind of an anti-religious moment, where it's quite okay to ban the veil, for example, to kind of criticize certain kinds of religions. in a way that sort of implies that there's a kind of lack of toleration on our part towards practices that were accepted for centuries. I do think that there are some weird things happening at the moment.
Okay, please, Angie.
Thank you. To just pick up the Twitter and the internet point, which is, I've got a happy story about this because I first started off doing public of understanding of philosophy work. Well, I've been doing it unofficially for nearly 20 years, but I started doing it officially in 2009. Went on Twitter then, and I remember thinking in advance, like, I must only do this if I feel robust enough to turn on the computer or see my BlackBerry and see really awful tweets and emails, and do I feel I can cope with that? And I thought, well, I probably can. And I just feel, it's probably because I'm not famous, but I feel I'm in a very cosy, mutually supportive corner of Twitter. I've had maybe 2 or 3 tweets and emails since 2009, which were even remotely offensive, and I was enormously encouraged by that. I do, as I said, I do know people like Mary Beard who had the most appalling stuff, and then the debate is, do you retweet it so all your followers can see and you expose these people, or do you just ignore it? And I think it depends just how vile the thing is. On the whole, I could just totally ignore the 1 or 2 that have come my way, thinking, how sad do you have to be to sit down in the evening and think, what shall I do with my evening? I know, I'll send a vicious tweet or email to somebody I've never met. I mean, how weird is that? On one occasion, I did receive an email from somebody, a former student who was still lurking around campus at a former university. I taught at saying that he thought on principle that all women should be raped, just on principle. I did take that to the police. But it is interesting. So my experience is that Twitter has been a wonderful demonstration of, in a way, there is a lot of tolerance in a lot of our society. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just on the question of religion and Unitarianism and freedom of speech, I suppose I would make a distinction between freedom of speech and freedom to broadcast. It does seem to me generally debates on toleration have been whether people have the freedom to be able to speak. The question of whether broadcasting time is fairly shared between different religious groups is a different but interesting question. I would always speak up for secular humanism, which I think is still not allowed certain bits in Thought for the Day, which would be nice to hear every now and then. Of the question here, I'm trying to remember what you said exactly.
The question was, what in the story would you say has undone toleration on a big scale?
Right. Well, it seems to me toleration is always in a potentially fragile situation in that you have ideological and particularly religious positions which will define themselves in theoretically extreme, absolute, intolerant ways. And I think the history of toleration has often been written according to how those absolute positions are expressed. In practice, I think those absolute positions do not convert into how most religious people act and behave. However, at times of tension, political, socio-economic, they provide a very ready target and a very clear explanation of what you should do with that ready target, which books of scripture will say, and they're not terribly nice either. So it seems to be when there is a need for, and when there are people prepared to direct potential ideological hostility, then it's very, very easy to end up with your major or minor holocaust as a result.
That's political Islam.
Just really quickly, Angie.
Ideals of purity.
Yes.
What we tolerate now, just could not be tolerable in the past or vice versa. It's a product of ideology. What we hate, what we can tolerate or we can't, is changeable due to time or just due to ideology or hegemony of this mode of thinking.
I think there is a difference between judging ideas and judging what people say or how people are thinking, and judging a person And I think when children are being taught to be non-judgmental, what they're being taught to do is not to confuse those things. And I think that a lot of the points that were made on the panel about toleration or tolerance leading to a very healthy debate of ideas and advance of ideas in society is helped, in fact, by that distinction. Because, I mean, I've got a slight sort of story to tell about today, that I was in a yoga session, and at the end of the yoga session, a man stood up and said, "I've really enjoyed this yoga session to be amongst all these lovely ladies, and they're all so quiet." Now, to me, my initial response to that was a completely unacceptable thing to say, and I felt quite cross. But then I had the opportunity to reflect about what it was exactly that statement was doing to me, and how that was affecting me, and how I wanted to engage with the man. And I didn't want to engage with him in a way that was simply going to shut him up. Because what progress can be made if I do that? So by getting over my judgment of him as, in a sense, a bad person, having said such a terrible thing, and being able to then engage with him in a way that didn't alienate him, progress could be made. So I think that's what the distinction I'm trying to make there.
I think as well we should not forget the role of the media in generating intolerance and hatred. At the moment, we are being taught to hate the skivers and shirkers. Yet only 3% of the national welfare budget goes to people who are unemployed. The rest goes to people in work, to pensioners, and so on. The same is true of we are being taught to hate various religions. We shouldn't be looking at religions we hate or religions we like. We should think about not what the God is, but what is done in their name.
Should we be more concerned than we apparently are when our government sets out to create, in its own language, a hostile environment? It has chosen to use the phrase a hostile environment in relation to one particular group at the moment, but there are many groups in our society who feel that they already live in hostile environments, not simply because they read some of the daily right-wing press, but because they find themselves on the wrong side of economic circumstances or social circumstances. And yet we seem to accept that the power in the land, the government, can set out as an act of policy, some might say ideology, to create a hostile environment in our country. And I'd like to ask that question in relation to today, because quite a lot of our points of reference this evening have been 400 BC or Nazi Germany, which seems a bit obvious, forgive me saying that. There are very few people who will sign up to say, yeah, that sounded like a good idea, even if we think differently now. But are we on the slippery slope when we connive in the use of that sort of language?
I think the point this lady made here was a really excellent one about distinguishing belief or practice from the person. I completely concur with that. The point over there, now, we seem to have a society, the point that was just made. I couldn't actually work out which of the many groups that are currently being targeted you had most in mind. Was it illegal immigrants? It seems to me our government is making so very many groups feel unwelcome. So who did you particularly have in mind?
Well, the latest phrase related to alleged illegal immigrants.
Yes, that was that horrible round. Yeah.
You've got a plentiful choice.
Yes, you do. I thought that was the one you meant most. Yes, I think this is very, very shabby tactics that you always get in the final 18 months or so, leading up to the next election. I entirely concur with that. They should know better. I think that Home Office ban, that was a disgrace. I think it's now been taken away, isn't it, that slogan? And then there was one. Who was the final?
The policy. The policy.
Not the policy. No. I agree. So, what I've learned tonight, I've learned a lot from both my fellow panellists and the audience. This is clearly a very vibrant debate. I still, I take entirely the historical points and the sociological points that have been made, I still want to hang on to the fact that on the whole, the arguments from philosophy say that in nearly all circumstances, tolerance and toleration have far more benefits than they do detractions, but there are lines that can be crossed, particularly in terms of causing physical harm and possibly real psychological abuse, and that I would differ from Frank there. I think it is possible to use verbs of tolerance and toleration of those kind of abusive practices. I think that's linguistically possible, and I think it's unacceptable. So I hope I've set out clearly the boundaries that should not be crossed when tolerance and toleration do slip into, I know we have a different view here, they do slip into laziness and indifference and ultimately cowardice. Okay, thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So then
I really enjoyed the discussion tonight, and I actually learned quite a lot from my fellow panelists, which is always nice. That doesn't often happen. Not because I'm particularly, sort of intelligent, but because we often talk in a way that isn't a dialogue or a discussion, but often there's an element of showing off or just making a statement. The discussion tonight is about tolerance, which is why I haven't spoken about the inequities of our contemporary society and the various things that are quite objectionable that are part of this government's policy, but also the last government. I find it very difficult to make a big distinction between the last 3 or 4 governments. If they are, it's paper thin. And I am just not talking about tolerance because I think that's what this meeting is really all about. And it's also something that we're not really taking up and arguing about sufficiently. I mean, we are facing a situation where a lot of liberties that used to exist in the past have been scrapped. And I'm often surprised that we can have things like double jeopardy in law, we can have things to do with the jury system. All these things just disappear, and people look at their shoelaces and they're not particularly worried about it. And I think tolerance is one of them. Plays all of a sudden get cancelled because the play has got a certain controversial subject to it. We have new laws that have been put in about incitation to religious hatred, which just gets passed and people nod and if they are too bored to worry about it. And our liberties have really been whittled away in the last 2 governments, bit by bit, and I think that should be a cause for concern. I want to make a fairly unpopular point, but I do think it's important. That relates to your statement about judgmentalism, making a distinction between the ideas and the person. I think that there is, particularly in pedagogy, an attempt to create that sort of distinction, and I think there is a distinction. But I do think that making judgments as kind of humane, intelligent individuals does not end with the ideas. I don't know about you, but when I see somebody who's behaving like an idiot, I don't say to myself, that's really interesting, person, and kind of move on. I make a judgment in my mind that this person, has got certain views that are objectionable. Maybe it's not a person I'm going to take seriously. As a teacher, I know I shouldn't be saying this, but as a teacher of students, I've been making judgments about them all my life. All my life. That's part of teaching, and part of my judgments is to know who needs more pressure, who needs that kind of gentle kick up the rear end to work a little bit harder, who needs support, who needs to be insulated from some of the problems that they're facing. So, making judgments is part and parcel of our life, and to teach our children that is in any shape or form a bad thing, that it leads to bullying and whatever, I think this misses the trick altogether. It infantilizes children, which is what we're doing in our school system, rather than take them seriously. It doesn't educate them for freedom, which is what we should really be doing. And it seems to me that of all the points that have come up tonight, it is this capacity to judge, and it's the celebration of judgment. It's the insistence that we're more judgmental. I think that really comes out from it, because unless we celebrate and cultivate that, we're not going to be re-establish a public arena, a public space, where there can be a more grown-up, mature dialogue, where we can clarify our ideas, and then deal, through that, through a struggle for ideas, then begin to deal with all the inequities that people have mentioned. But to fight those inequities, you need to have strong ideas, a clarity of purpose, and know where you're going.
I think one or two of the final questions we're talking about whether society changes what is tolerance, about the creation of a hostile environment, who might be behind it. Obviously, the state may be behind it, the media might, religious leaders wanting to whip up a moral case or whatever. But it does seem to me, if we talk about society in general terms, we're talking about all of us. And it does seem to me where intolerance is being whipped up, if we are not reacting against that, then we are participating in it, either implicitly or explicitly. And in a sense, the point about a tolerant society is that we should all be prepared to act to try and to put down that sort of degree of intolerance. On the issue of separating out ideas and people, I think that's really the key to how tolerance has worked in the past. Whether it works pedagogically with small children, I wouldn't like to comment on at all, not having any. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that toleration in social terms is about people's capacity to distinguish a Catholic, a Jew, or a Muslim from Islam, Catholicism, Judaism, and that the roots of practical toleration derive from being able to make that distinction. That's a distinction just as important within Islam as within Christian groups. My final thought, I suppose, actually prompted by a comment that Frank made, which I think really hit the nail on the head about the importance of tolerance, which was referring to David Cameron's comment about tolerance being easy, but intolerance being tough. Just a couple of days ago, I read precisely that thing being stated. It was stated in 1943 by Heinrich Himmler addressing the SS, that the problem with the German people was that they were theoretically opposed to Judaism, but in practice they would always say, oh, but that Jew's okay, because I know him well. There was exactly the same emphasis, that the true strength of the SS was its capacity to not feel any toleration. I'm not suggesting Cameron is a member of the SS, but nevertheless, I do think the suggestion that tolerance is a form of weakness is something that's so very, very important to oppose.
Okay, brilliant. We've had our panel, please.